She was just a little girl until she exposed a murder ring. Lila Carter was 6 when her father died, and her world went silent. They called it an accident. They told her he was gone. They told her everything would be okay. But her eyes said otherwise. And her dog Atlas never stopped watching. For months, the girl didn't speak, not to her teachers, not to her doctor, not even to her mother. But then came the trial. The man in the courtroom, the one with the gold ring. And Lila began to remember. With every word, the walls began to crack, not just in her mind, but around a criminal network built on betrayal, payoffs, and the blood of those who tried to stand up. Her testimony, guided by a dog's gaze, would change everything. This is the story of how a child became the voice for the silenced, and how one German shepherd helped bring a hidden truth into the light. Watch closely. This story will leave you breathless. The storm rolled in before dawn, the kind that sneaks ash-gray clouds over the roofs and makes sirens sound farther away than they are. By 8 o'clock, rain drummed the copper gutters of the Brookhaven County Courthouse and turned the granite steps slick as glass. News vans lined up like bright, dented birds along Maple Street, their telescoping masts peering over the oaks toward the third-floor windows. Reporters in plastic ponchos rehearsed solemn openers into wind-shivered microphones. A deputy propped the heavy door with his boot, letting in a thin, cold breath that smelled of wet wool and pavement. Inside, courtroom 3A swelled to its seams. The benches had the shine of 100 years of grief rubbed into their arms. People leaned forward with folded hands and careful faces, the way you do in church when the organ falls silent. They were here for what had been billed as routine testimony, in-state versus Monroe, an assault case, ugly but ordinary. The victim's name, Sarah Carter, ran in a murmured loop down the benches, like a prayer no one remembered learning, only repeating. Her hospital bed deposition had given the prosecution a spine. Today was meant to be connective tissue, a child witness. 15 minutes, maybe 20. Get through it, move on. At the bench sat Judge Evelyn Grant, 70 if a day. Though the set of her shoulders still suggested a marathon runner who'd learned to pace the hills. She had presided over this room long enough to know exactly how quiet could harden, how attention could sharpen to a point so fine it could cut. Her robe hung straight as a plumb line, fluorescence whenever she lifted her chin. She knew the facts, knew the photographs, knew the doctor's testimony better than the doctor did. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was whether a 5-year-old who hadn't spoken in 2 years could place words in the world that would stay. On the other side, Victor Hale sat with a flat smile and an immaculate navy suit that made his skin look polished. Hale had built a reputation on apologies that sounded like mercy and objections that sounded like common sense. He guarded his legal pad the way a man guards a confession he's not ready to make. When he glanced at the gallery, his gaze skimmed over faces like a stone over dark water, never touching long enough to sink. The bailiff called the room to order. The sound bounced off wood and window and bone until it settled into a hush so complete you could hear the soft tick of the courtroom clock and the rain sharpening to points against the glass. A woman coughed, then swallowed it back like regret. 2 jurors exchanged a small, startled look out of habit, not disrespect, then fixed their attention on the empty witness chair, as if the chair itself might tell them the truth. The door near the bench opened. A victim advocate slipped in first, followed by a slender child in a yellow raincoat, too big through the shoulders, the hood down, the curls damp. Lila Carter. 5 years old by the calendar, older by the set of her mouth. In her right hand she carried a stuffed fox the color of fallen leaves. Its stitched grin had been rubbed at so often that the thread had fuzzed to fur. Lila paused to look at the rows of strangers, then at the glossy floor that showed broken pieces of their shoes. Judge Grant leaned forward, her fingers tenting in front of the nameplate. "Good morning, Miss Carter." The judge's voice had the softness of felt laid over wood. "We will take our time." The child didn't nod, didn't shake her head. She simply climbed into the big chair the way a small bird might hop from one twig to the next, quick and exact. The fox ended up on her lap. The advocate stood to the side, hands folded like someone holding a warm bowl. Anna Morales rose, gentle in the way good surgeons are gentle with a blade. "Lila," she said, and the name settled into the room. "I'm Anna. I'll ask you small questions. You can answer just the ones you want. If you want to stop, you can stop." From the defense table came the careful cough of a man preparing himself to appear patient. Hale, the smile barely there, tapped his pen once, then stilled it. The rain slackened. The lights hummed. A deputy's radio didn't know its name yet, only that it was already here, and all at once in that great, careful silence everyone breathed, as if they were trying not to be heard. They brought him in on soft paws. The door opened near the jury box, and Atlas entered with the measured grace of an old soldier who still remembered the cadence. 9 years had thickened his chest and silvered the fur along his muzzle, but time had not taken the straightness of his spine or the clear, steady light in his eyes. A handler in a plain blue jacket held the leash, slack and respectful. The shepherd's nails clicked once on the polished floor, then quieted, his gait adjusting to the room's need for quiet. No one announced him. They didn't have to. The fact of him was its own introduction. Heads lifted as if a new wind had found its way inside. Juror 7's mouth parted around a small involuntary "oh." In the gallery someone pressed palms together without meaning to, a reflex older than words. Atlas stopped 3 feet from the witness stand and sat, a perfect square of patience and attention. He did not look at the judge or the prosecutor. He looked at the child. Lila's fingers found the fox's ear and worried it smooth, while she studied the dog right back. She had watched videos of him, they said, in a quiet office with a woman who whispered to her about courage, as if courage were a stray you could coax closer with a saucer of milk. But a screen is one thing, a heartbeat is another. The dog's breath made a soft sound in the big room. His eyes, brown the way river water is brown, full of light if you know how to see it, did not waver. "Miss Carter," Judge Grant said, and something gentle moved into her voice, a timbre one reserves for a skittish colt or a memory. "Atlas is allowed to sit near you today. If you'd like to touch him, you may. If you'd rather not, that's all right too." Lila's right hand, the one not occupied by the fox, drifted toward the edge of the chair, then stopped, then settled on the fabric again, like a bird setting down on a reed in a wind. The handler loosened his hold and took a single step back. Atlas didn't move, not even the tilt of an ear. Outside the windows the rain softened to a steady whisper. Inside, you could hear the slight sounds humans make when they are trying not to make sounds at all. A throat cleared into a sleeve. A shoe shifted under a bench. The wet drip of an umbrella tucked beneath a pew. The whole room balanced on a wire. Lila slid forward until the fox teetered on her knees. Her palm hovered in the space between them, dog and child, the air there warm with the heat of breath and living. And then, with a small courage that looked almost like gravity, she let her hand fall into the rough, dense fur at Atlas's neck. The change in the dog was not dramatic. Half-lidded, as if he were listening hard to a music the rest of them could not hear. Lila's fingers threaded into his ruff, and then, as if a knot in her chest had found the end of its own thread, she exhaled. It was such a small sound, that first word, that the court reporter looked up from her machine as if she'd imagined it. "Atlas," Lila whispered, not to the room, but to the dog, as though speaking into his ear would not count against her. The syllables were stiff with disuse, like a door opening after a winter's worth of snow. "Atlas, tell them what really happened to Daddy." The word Daddy went through the courtroom like a thrown stone through still water. It struck, and the circles moved outward, bench, jury, counsel, gallery, until they reached the walls and came back again. A ballpoint pen slipped from someone's fingers and hit the floor, a bright, brittle sound that made a few people flinch. The court reporter's hands hovered, then raced to catch up. Ana Morales forgot to breathe. The advocate pressed her lips together and blinked hard at her own shoes. In the second row, a woman made the small, keening sound of someone who had once prayed and was suddenly trying again. At the defense table, Victor Hale's pen stopped its careful tapping. For a heartbeat, he stared at the child with a look that was almost pity, and then his features rearranged themselves into something else entirely, something tighter around the mouth and whiter through the knuckles. He put the pen down as if it had grown hot. Judge Grant's mug was empty, but her fingers tightened around it anyway. She had spent a lifetime asking for the truth. It had rarely arrived like this, on a child's breath, in a dog's orbit, wrapped in the hush of a room that knew it was hearing something it might never hear again. "Let the record reflect," she said, her voice measured to keep the tremor out, "that the witness has spoken." If anyone had been waiting for thunder, it never came. The storm stayed outside. In here, the shock rolled through them without sound. Atlas did not lift his gaze from the child. There are truths that enter a room the way a draft does, thin, curious, half afraid of being noticed. This one arrived like the shore arriving for a wave. It took its time. It altered the ground, even as it receded. Ana Morales approached the stand slowly, the way you approach a skittish animal on the edge of the woods. "Lila," she said softly, her voice rounded at. He had a silver ring. It flashed when the lights went by. A dozen small, involuntary reactions rippled through the courtroom. The hitch of a breath, the shift of a knee, the pencil that scratched harder than before. Juror 3 lifted her chin a fraction, as if the air had changed shape at her nose. The court reporter's foot moved restlessly under her machine, as if it needed to run. Victor Hale was suddenly very busy aligning his legal pad with the edge of the table. He squared it, then squared it again. The second hand of the wall clock seemed to grow louder, ticking into the porous places of the room. When Hale reached for his pen, his fingers missed it and found the wood instead. He left them there, palm down, like a man steadying himself on a rolling deck. Did the man say anything? Morales asked, careful with the spaces between words. Lila's brow knit. She shook her head once, small. I don't remember words. Her hand tightened in Atlas's coat, and the dog accepted the pressure without an ounce of flinch. But he was there before the police cars. The ring, it looked like it was winking. The judge's eyes flicked, quick as a swallow, toward the defense table. She wasn't alone. 2 jurors, nearly in unison, glanced in the same direction, as if some shared creature inside them had turned its head to look. Hale felt the attention like heat against his cheek. He adjusted his cuff, revealing a glimpse of watchband, then tugged the sleeve back down with the precision of a man correcting a misfiled document. Hale stood. Objection, Your Honor. His voice, smooth as an oiled hinge, reached for the old authority. Calls for speculation. The witness is 5. Overruled, Judge Grant said, not unkindly. We will hear her. Morales didn't smile. She lowered her voice. Lila, do you remember where you were when you saw the ring? Lila's gaze slid away, somewhere toward the rain-silvered window, then returned to Atlas, as if she had learned the trick of finding north by the constant the dog provided. By the window, she said. I was supposed to be asleep. Mommy was crying, so I listened. The lights made the ring blink. There was a looseness at the corners of Hale's mouth that hadn't been there a moment earlier. He bent toward his co-counsel as if to consult, then didn't. A line appeared at the hinge of his jaw, a swallow that didn't quite complete itself. The pen he'd abandoned found its way back under his fingers. He gripped it too tight, then too loose. Ana Morales felt something cold and bright open behind her breastbone, the way a door opens when insulting. Because he remembers, she said. He's good at remembering. She turned her face, finally, away from Atlas and toward the defense table. Not because anyone asked her to, not because anyone told her to, but because children, like dogs, sometimes move toward the source of danger without knowing why. He remembers, the man with the ring. The room didn't breathe for a heartbeat. Atlas rose, slow as tide, and placed himself not more than a foot forward, nothing overt, nothing anyone could rightly object to, so that the bulk of his chest formed a quiet rampart between the child and the defense table. His tail hung at a measured neutral angle. His ears tipped, not flat, not aggressive, just keen. If loyalty had a posture, it might look like that. Mr. Hale, Judge Grant said, and there was nothing yet in her tone but the levelness of a spirit level laid against a wall. You will sit. Hale hadn't realized he'd started to stand. He sat. The legal pad, so recently squared, was no longer even with the table's edge. He didn't touch it. The tremor, the first one, passed through the room and left things where they had not been before. The jurors sat a little straighter. The rain returned in a picked-out rhythm that sounded, now, like thoughts assembling. The court reporter's fingers flew, and her eyes shone as though she were writing something she would tell someone she loved about pie that night. Ms. Morales, Judge Grant said, eyes still on the child, you may proceed. Morales nodded once, and in the small space between that nod and her next word, the room understood. This case was no longer what it had been when they came in from the rain. Atlas did not look away from Hale. Brookhaven was the kind of town where neighbors knew who left their porch light on, where the diner waitress remembered not just your name but the way you liked your coffee. For years, Officer David Carter had been the quiet constant in that tapestry, broad-shouldered, calm-eyed, the one people trusted to show up when the world tilted the wrong way. His devotion to duty wasn't measured in commendations or medals, though he had a few of those tucked in a drawer at home. It was measured in the way he knelt to speak to frightened children eye to eye, or how he lingered after shift to patch a broken taillight for a struggling single mother. Beside him was Maria Carter, his wife, fierce and unyielding in her own right. As a county investigator, Maria had earned a reputation that made both criminals and complacent colleagues wary. She believed every discrepancy mattered, every number out of place, every witness statement that didn't quite align. The truth, she liked to say, doesn't shout. It whispers. You have to lean close enough to hear it. Together they were more than a couple. They were a force, two lines of defense against the erosion of honesty in a world that often looked away. At home, though, were simply Mom and Dad to their daughter, Lila. Nights in the Carter house often ended with storybooks spread across the couch, Maria's laughter spilling into the hallway, and David's steady hum as he carried a sleeping toddler to bed. But the world has a way of turning even the strongest constants into fragile glass. It was 2 years ago, on a November night, when rain slicked the highway into a black ribbon of mirrors. David and Maria had been driving back from a late briefing, Maria insisting they take one car to save gas, David teasing her about her habit of calculating pennies while chasing criminals who pocketed millions. Somewhere along Highway 14, their patrol car lost control. That was the story the official report would later tell. Driver error, fatigue, bad weather. The kind of accident no one could fight against. The crash left the road scarred with bent guardrails and scattered glass, the rain washing away everything except the aching silence of what had been. By morning, Brookhaven had lost not just 2 public servants, but a husband and wife whose absence cracked the very rhythm of the town. And Lila, barely 3 years old, had lost everything that tethered her. The funeral was held at the First Baptist Church, where sunlight streamed weakly through stained glass and landed on rows of officers in dress uniforms. 2 caskets stood side by side, draped with folded flags that seemed too heavy for the polished wood beneath. The bugle sounded, clear and cruel, echoing down the aisles until even the strongest men in uniform blinked hard at their shoes. In the front row, a small child sat on her aunt's lap, her curls brushed into order though her tiny fists refused to unclench. Lila did not cry, though every adult around her seemed to. Her eyes fixed on the flags, unblinking, as if by staring long enough, she might call her parents back from beneath them. When the rifles fired the salute outside, she only flinched once, then clutched tighter to the toy fox her father had given her on her last birthday. The town mourned, but grief fell heaviest on the toddler, who didn't yet have words to shape what had been stolen from her. By the time the final hymn faded, Brookhaven knew 2 things. The Carters were gone, and their daughter would never be the same. The months that followed blurred together in the way grief does. Long nights, too many casseroles left on the porch, well-meaning neighbors whose voices cracked with pity. Lila went to live with her aunt for a time, a woman who loved her, but who carried her own family's chaos. The little girl was fed, clothed, protected, yet something essential in her laughter, her chat, shutting down the voice. If she doesn't speak, she doesn't relive. But definitions didn't make it easier to watch a once bubbling child sit mute while the world tried to coax sound from her lips. Lila drifted from therapist to therapist. Offices smelled of antiseptic and colored markers, shelves stacked with toys meant to draw out hidden words. Most sessions ended the same, a child coloring silently while adults traded worried glances above her head. But the drawings themselves were their own language. Again and again, She sketched the same images: a long dark road that bent into shadow, rain streaking down in slanted lines, and a single object shining brighter than the rest, a ring, silver, always drawn with the crayon pressed so hard it tore the paper. Her aunt once asked what it meant, but Lila only lowered her eyes and drew another line of rain until the page filled with storms. Time dulled the immediacy of the tragedy for others. The town moved on, offices transferred, headlines faded, but silence remained Lila's constant companion. Her world shrank to the pages of her sketchpad and the battered fox she carried everywhere, its stitched smile frayed at the edges. 2 years passed. She grew taller, her hair longer, but her voice stayed locked away, an unopened box inside her chest, and if anyone doubted that she remembered what happened that night, all they had to do was look at her drawings. She remembered too well. Loss is not the language of humans alone. Dogs know it in their bones, in the way they wait by doors that never open again. Atlas had once been the pride of the K-9 unit, partnered with Officer Daniel Mason. For 8 years they worked the streets side by side. Atlas sniffing out narcotics in damp basements, tracking fugitives through pine thickets, standing tall during school demonstrations where children squealed and reached for his fur. Daniel used to joke that the dog was braver than most men he knew and smarter than half of them. But courage cannot shield anyone from disease. Daniel's cancer crept in silently, at first a cough, then a shadow on a scan, then months of treatments that left him thinner, weaker, but still determined to wear his uniform as long as he could. Atlas stayed at his feet through it all, at the hospital bed, at the living room recliner, even at the bathroom door, unwilling to leave his partner's side. The end came on a gray morning when winter still pressed against the windows. When Daniel's breathing stuttered and finally stopped, Atlas lay down beside the boots at the foot of the bed and did not move for hours. He pressed his head against the leather, his chest rising in a shallow rhythm, as if by sinking himself to the stillness he could refuse to accept it. Daniel's widow, Eleanor Mason, found herself grieving not only her husband, but the hollowed dog who had lost him. She took Atlas home, not because she knew how to heal him, but because she recognized the look in his eyes. It mirrored her own. In her small house on Elm Street, Atlas would curl beside Daniel's empty chair and wait. Eleanor would sometimes catch herself speaking aloud, only to realize she wasn't talking to Daniel's memory, but to the dog who carried it. They grieved together, woman and animal, each a witness to the other's loss. Some nights she would fall asleep with her hand in his fur, the steady beat of his heart the only rhythm convincing her that life still moved forward. For Atlas, Eleanor's presence was a fragile tether, a reminder that though one bond had been severed, another had formed in its place. In that quiet household, surrounded by photographs of a man they both loved, Atlas and Eleanor learned to breathe again, one day at a time. And neither of them could have known then that fate was quietly shaping a meeting that would bring a little girl's silence and a dog's grief into the same room and ignite a truth powerful enough to tear open the lies of the past. The afternoon sun painted weak stripes across Eleanor Mason's kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea she hadn't touched. Outside, elm branches scraped the siding as if they sensed her unrest. On the muted television, a news anchor's voice still echoed in her mind. Tomorrow, 5-year-old Leila Carter is expected to take the stand. Eleanor had muted it quickly, but not before seeing the image, a small girl in a pale dress clutching a stuffed fox. The headline scrolled below, "Selective mutism. No one knows if she'll speak." She knew the Carter name. Her late husband Daniel had trusted David Carter, one of the few. Eleanor still remembered that November night. Daniel pacing by the fire, muttering about skid marks too short. A civilian lawyer arriving before first responders. Days later, the cancer took over. She closed her eyes and saw Daniel hollowed by chemo, still reaching to pat Atlas's flank when the dog pressed close. "Something's off about that crash," he'd whispered. Then the morphine stole his voice. Now a child who had not spoken in 2 years was being asked to testify. Eleanor glanced at Atlas, older now, the black on his muzzle salted gray. He lifted his head at her voice. "Maybe you could help her." The next morning, Eleanor climbed the courthouse steps slowly, Atlas at her side. Some turned to stare. The police dog retired after Daniel's funeral, who'd stood at attention even as the rifle salute cracked the sky. Inside, the prosecutor, Anna Morales, blinked in surprise. "Mrs. Mason, what are you doing with Atlas?" Eleanor said simply. "I came because I heard about the girl, about Leila. I think Atlas could help her." Morales hesitated. "That's generous, but softened. The defense will say it's prejudicial. A dog might sway the jury emotionally."
"Let them," Eleanor said. "If the child can find her voice with him there, isn't that more important than how it looks on paper?" An hour later, Eleanor stood before Judge Evelyn Grant in chambers. Atlas sat quietly at her feet, posture perfect, as if he knew this was sacred ground. "I've no precedent for this," the judge said. "Therapy animals in criminal court are controversial." Eleanor drew a deep breath. "Your Honor, I've buried a husband. I know what it is to be silenced. That child, she carries a silence heavier than any coffin. Atlas has walked through loss, like she has. He doesn't need to speak to give her courage. All he has to do is be." Judge Grant studied Atlas for a long moment. Finally, she exhaled. "He may accompany her, under strict conditions. If there's disruption, he's out." Eleanor's eyes glistened. "Thank you." As they left chambers, Atlas pressed gently against her leg. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt Daniel's presence, not as a wound, but as something still walking beside her. The victim services room was small and spare, oatmeal walls, harsh lights, tired carpet that smelled faintly of disinfectant. At a child-sized table in the corner, Lila Carter sat alone. A crayon box lay beside her, paper wrappers frayed. She colored methodically, not a line crossed. Her stuffed fox leaned against her elbow, fur patchy and worn. The advocate nearby said nothing, clipboard in hand. Everyone knew that pushing Lila only deepened the silence. Then the door opened. Eleanor entered first. Behind her, Atlas moved with the silent confidence of someone long retired from duty, yet still answering it. He didn't approach the child. He simply walked a few feet into the room and sat, upright, watchful, still. Lila froze. Her crayon paused mid-line. She felt the shift in the room immediately. Her eyes lifted. She saw him. Their gazes met, her hollow stare, his quiet strength. The advocate held her breath. Eleanor stood motionless. She had seen this look before, the way Atlas could find pain by scent alone. Lila lowered her crayon but didn't look down. She watched him. He didn't move, didn't wag, just wait. 1 minute passed, then 2. Atlas blinked. His tail brushed the carpet once, a whisper of reassurance. Lila shifted in her chair. She looked down at her fox, then back at the dog. And slowly, as if crossing a canyon plank by plank, she reached out her hand. Atlas leaned forward, calm, respectful, until her fingertips touched the top of his head. The advocate gasped. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth, the air like bells in winter. The advocate began to cry quietly. Eleanor's eyes blurred. Atlas blinked slowly, tail wagging once, solemn, steady. Lila didn't let go. She kept her hand on his head, drawing something from him, warmth, safety, presence. Her fox slipped to the floor, forgotten. And for the first time in 2 years, the silence that defined her began to lift. That night, Eleanor sat on the porch, Atlas at her feet. She watched the sky dim to indigo, stars blooming between drifting clouds. She didn't need to say anything. The image played over in her mind, a little hand reaching out, a voice breaking through silence. It hadn't taken therapy. It hadn't taken time. It had taken a dog who waited, and the girl who chose to believe he was listening. Tomorrow, Lila will testify. But tonight she had already spoken. And it was enough. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, whispering a prayer of thanks to Daniel, to fate, to whatever force had brought this child and this dog together. When she opened them again, she saw it plain. Atlas had found his new mission, and the child had found the bridge back to her own voice. The room was silent but for the hum of the lights, the scrape of crayons sliding off the table, and the soft rhythm of breath shared between a grieving girl and a grieving dog. And in that fragile space, something extraordinary had begun. The room was silent but alive, filled with the fragile hum of something unspoken. The fluorescent lights above flickered faintly, casting pale halos on the scuffed linoleum floor of the victim services suite. Eleanor sat pressed against the back of her chair, hands folded over her lap, as if holding herself together. Her eyes, lined with the tired creases of grief and years of waiting, were fixed not on the child, but on the dog lying just a few feet away. Atlas. He wasn't doing anything remarkable. No barking, no tricks, no demand for attention. He simply existed with a grace only a creature like him could carry. Chest rising and falling with patient rhythm, ears angled slightly forward, amber eyes glancing toward the little girl coloring at the table. His tail tapped against the floor in a steady, soft beat, like the muted ticking of a grandfather clock. And then, the moment that felt almost impossible, Lila's hand moved. For so long, her tiny hands had trembled with the weight of silence, clinging to crayons like lifelines, but never reaching for the world outside. But now her palm hovered mid-air, hesitant, shaking just. That spoke louder than words. I will be here whether you touch me or not.
And then Lila's fingers brushed his back.
Her whisper cracked the air, like glass breaking in a cathedral. 2 words, simple, small, but in their frailty was the weight of resurrection. For 2 years, no one had heard her voice, not in therapy, not in school, not in the quiet moments of routine. But now, for this dog, this unexpected companion, she had reached into the silence and found her voice again. Eleanor's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes blurred with tears, hot and unstoppable. She had prayed for signs like this, begged for something, anything, that might show that Lila's spirit wasn't lost forever. And here it was, wrapped in the wag of a tail and the soft fur beneath a child's trembling hand. Prosecutor Morales, who had been standing near the doorway with arms crossed in skeptical detachment, straightened as if struck. His gaze darted between the girl and the dog, the measured calculation in his expression cracking. For weeks he had prepared himself to stand in court with nothing more than paper evidence and clinical testimony. He had braced for a fragile child, unable to speak, leaving the jury to connect the dots without her voice. But this was different. He took a tentative step into the room. His voice, usually clipped and commanding, softened. She spoke.
Eleanor nodded quickly, her tears spilling freely.
Yes, did you hear it? She called him a good boy.
Atlas's ears flicked at the praise, tail thumping faster. He turned his head toward Lila, offering a soft huff of breath, the kind of sound dogs make when they want you to know you are safe. Lila giggled. It was faint, almost uncertain, but real. A sound that sliced through the stale, heavy air, like sunlight cutting through storm clouds.
She pressed her palm more firmly into his fur, shoulders loosening as if a burden was slowly uncoiling inside her.
Morales's throat worked as he swallowed hard. The pragmatist in him warred with the witness of his own eyes. He knew courts didn't run on miracles. They ran on facts, sworn statements, admissible evidence. But he also knew juries were made of people, and people responded to humanity, to the truth they could feel. And this felt undeniable.
This dog.
Morales's voice trailed off as if he feared finishing the sentence would make it too vulnerable. He shook his head, starting again with a steadier tone.
Atlas might be the key. He's reaching her in ways none of us could.
Eleanor's gaze remained locked on the girl and the dog, her voice breaking as she whispered,
He's doing what Henry always believed was possible.
Her late husband's suspicions about the case, his belief in connections others dismissed, seemed to echo through the moment. Alive again, closer to Lila. He nudged her crayon gently with his nose, a playful encouragement. She giggled again and dropped the crayon to wrap both arms around his thick neck. For the first time in years, she clung to something other than fear. Eleanor covered her mouth with both hands now, shoulders shaking with sobs that were equal parts grief and gratitude. She had waited so long to see hope flicker in this little girl's eyes, and it was here, right in front of her, born not from a court order or a therapy session, but from the quiet heartbeat of a dog who had once been discarded himself. The silence that followed wasn't empty anymore. It was full of possibility, of unspoken promises, of futures that might finally break open. Morales let out a slow breath and looked toward Eleanor, his resolve hardening into something new. We need to rethink everything. With Atlas, we might just have a chance. Eleanor wiped her tears and nodded, her voice raw but steady. Then let's give her that chance. Atlas wagged his tail again, as if sealing the vow with his own unspoken agreement. In that small windowless room, with its humming fluorescent lights and scattered crayons, a fragile bond had been born, one that carried the power to shift an entire trial, to unlock truths long buried, and to reignite hope where only silence had lived before. And for Eleanor, watching with her heart stretched open, it was more than just hope. It was proof that even in the darkest corners, light could still find a way back in. The courtroom was hushed, the kind of silence that held its own weight, thick and almost suffocating. Lila sat in the witness chair, her legs barely reaching the floor, a box of crayons resting near her hand, on the ledge the victim services team had placed for her comfort. Beside her, Atlas lay stretched out on the cool tiles, his head resting on his paws, amber eyes flicking between her and the restless crowd. The faint hum of the air conditioner was the only sound for a few long, uncertain moments. Eleanor sat rigid on the bench, her fingers clasped tightly in her lap, watching every flicker of Lila's face. She could see the storm gathering inside the girl, fear, memory, the fragile strength that had only begun to show itself in recent days. Judge Grant leaned forward, his gavel resting idle, expression unusually gentle, as if he understood that the next word spoken here could crack everything wide open. "Lila," Prosecutor Morales said, his voice low and deliberate, "you're safe here. Do you remember what we practiced? You can just tell us what you saw, nothing more, nothing less." The little girl shifted, clutching Atlas's fur for courage. Her fingers curled into the thick mane around gallery, the journalists leaning forward, defense attorneys exchanging sharp looks, even the bailiff's eyes narrowing. Judge Grant raised a hand for silence, but the effect was already spreading, like a stone dropped into still water. Morales froze, though only for a heartbeat. He had spent weeks waiting, praying for Leela to speak beyond her nods and fractured phrases. He drew in a breath, steadying himself. "Can you tell us what kind of ring, Leela?" She swallowed, her small voice quivering. "Silver. It had a bird on it." Gasps this time, sharp, unfiltered, filled the courtroom. The sound echoed off the high ceilings, startling Leela. She flinched, burying her face against Atlas's shoulder. Instantly, Atlas lifted his head, leaning closer to her, a soft whine rumbling in his throat like reassurance. Eleanor pressed her palm against her lips, her eyes brimming. Judge Grant's gavel came down with a firm crack. "Order! This courtroom will remain in order." His voice was stern, but beneath it was something else, surprise and perhaps a glimmer of dread. Morales leaned closer to the witness stand, careful not to break the fragile trust, holding Leela steady. "You're doing so well, Leela," he said softly. "This bird, do you remember what kind it was?" Her eyes, glassy but determined, lifted from Atlas's fur. "An eagle." The wings were open. The defense scrambled at their table, papers shuffled, whispers hissed between attorneys. One of them, a sharp-faced man in a navy suit, rose immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. This is a child's imagination. It cannot be considered credible testimony." But even as he spoke, murmurs surged again across the room. Because everyone there knew, a ring like that wasn't a child's fantasy. It was real, distinctive, and already infamous in whispers that had circulated the precinct. A silver eagle's wings, spread wide, worn only by a select few men tied to the department's most controversial cases. Judge Grant's gaze shifted, heavy and unreadable. "Overruled," he said finally, his voice clipped. "The testimony stands. The jury will weigh its credibility." Leela's hand trembled as she clutched Atlas tighter. Eleanor could feel her chest tighten painfully, because in that moment she saw the same image her late husband had carried in his notes, the suspicions that had haunted him until the day he died. The silver ring, the shadow he had never been able to name aloud. Atlas wagged his tail once, a subtle movement, quiet but powerful in its timing. It was as though he understood that something important had just leaned down, whispered into his ear as though telling him alone. Then she looked up, voice breaking but clear. "Before the police came," the words hit like a thunderclap. A collective gasp tore through the courtroom. Reporters' pens scratched frantically. One even dropped his notebook in shock. A woman in the gallery pressed her hand to her mouth, muffling a cry. Eleanor closed her eyes, tears spilling freely now. She wasn't weeping only for the child who had found her voice, but for the man she had loved. For the truth he had sought, silenced too soon. Across the room, Morales straightened, a new fire in his chest. He turned to the jury, his voice carrying with a quiet conviction. "You heard her. She saw the man with the silver ring before the police arrived. That changes everything." The defense objected again, shouting now, their desperation echoing off the wood-paneled walls. Judge Grant hammered the gavel down 3 times, his jaw set tight. "Enough! The testimony will be recorded in full. We will recess to review its implications." As the gavel's echo faded, The room buzzed like a hornet's nest. But in the center of it all sat a small girl and a great dog, her hand still buried in his fur, his steady gaze fixed ahead, as though guarding her from the chaos she had just unleashed. And for the first time in 2 years, hope no longer felt like a distant memory. It felt like a living, breathing presence, wagging its tail softly at the edge of revelation. The courtroom was already tight with tension, every bench filled, every breath caught in a suspended rhythm after Lila's trembling words. The little girl's testimony still lingered in the air like smoke from a gunshot, its echoes impossible to silence. Then came the eruption. Victor Hale shot to his feet, his chair screeching back across the floor as though it recoiled from him. "Objection!" His voice boomed, cracking with something far more dangerous than righteous indignation. "This is outrageous. Utter fabrication from a traumatized child." His tone was too sharp, too desperate. For the first time since the trial began, the polished mask slipped. Eleanor froze, her hand still resting on Lila's shoulder. The girl flinched at the outburst, shrinking back into her chair. Morales stood calmly, the faintest flicker of satisfaction touching his features. He didn't need to say a word. Hale was doing his work for him. "Mr. Hale," Judge Grant's gavel struck once, the sound sharp as a rifle crack. "Compose yourself." But Hale couldn't. His breathing was uneven, chest heaving like a cornered animal. This is preposterous. You're allowing a child to dictate the fate of this courtroom?" His hands cut through the air, voice rising. Children stiffened, and a deep, resonant growl rolled from his chest. The sound was low, primal, more warning than attack, but it cut through the air with surgical precision. Every head turned. Atlas's eyes had locked on Hale. Not Hale's face, not his posture. His gaze was fixed lower, unwavering, at Hale's right hand, where a glint of silver caught the light, the ring. A simple band, unremarkable to most, but in that moment, under Atlas's stare, it became something else entirely, a symbol, a marker, a silent confession. Hale froze. His hand twitched as though to cover it, to hide the offending evidence of his own existence. But the motion only drew more eyes. Jurors leaned forward, their attention magnetized. A murmur rippled through the gallery. "Order," Judge Grant barked, but even his authority couldn't stifle the shift. Something irreversible had happened. Eleanor's breath caught. She knew Atlas, knew his instincts, his precision. He was no ordinary dog. He didn't growl without reason. And now his entire being was directed toward Victor Hale, like a compass finally finding north. Morales took a single step forward, his voice measured, quiet but deadly. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you see where even instinct points." He gestured subtly toward Atlas, whose growl deepened, vibrating through the floorboards. "This is not rehearsed, not staged. This is recognition, circumstantial." Hale spat, though his face had flushed crimson, sweat breaking at his temples. He tugged at his cuff as if to loosen the suffocating fabric. "You can't, this dog doesn't," but his words stumbled. For the first time, Victor Hale sounded less like a confident attorney and more like a desperate man clawing at the walls of a collapsing prison. Juror number 7, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes, leaned back and crossed her arms. Juror number 3, who had sat stone-faced for weeks, now whispered something to the man beside him, nodding toward Hale's hand. One by one, the dominoes of doubt began to tip. Atlas did not move. He only growled, steady, relentless, a living metronome of truth. His gaze never wavered. And then, almost imperceptibly, Lila raised her head. Her small, trembling finger pointed not to Atlas, not to Eleanor, but directly at the silver band, gleaming on Hale's hand. Her voice was faint but audible in the hushed chamber. "That's it," she whispered. "That's the ring." Silence detonated louder than any gavel. The jurors' eyes widened, their collective focus now sharpened to a single point. The man who had roared objections only minutes before now looked cornered, diminished, every twitch of his hand magnified under the scrutiny of 20 eyes and one unyielding German shepherd. Judge Grant leaned forward, gaze cutting into Hale. "Mr. Hale, do you wish to explain why this child identifies your ring as belonging?"
Sound came. His practiced eloquence, the arsenal of words he wielded like weapons, had abandoned him. The courtroom saw it, the unraveling, the mask cracking piece by piece. "Your Honor," Morales said softly, "the jury can draw its own conclusions. Sometimes the most powerful evidence is not shouted, it's revealed." Hale slammed his fist on the table. "This is a circus! You cannot convict me with a dog's growl and a child's imagination." His words, however, no longer rang with authority. They shook with fear. Atlas's growl cut through again. This time, Judge Grant didn't call for silence. He watched. Everyone did. The predator was exposed, and the courtroom knew it. The echo of the gavel struck like thunder, cutting through the crowded courtroom. Judge Grant's voice, calm but firm, filled the silence that followed. "We will take a 15-minute recess," he declared. The room exhaled at once, a swirl of murmurs rippling across the benches. Reporters scrawled furiously into their notepads, cameras clicked, and jurors shifted uneasily in their seats, whispering to one another as though they had just witnessed something far larger than the scope of the case before them. Atlas remained perfectly still at Eleanor's side, his dark eyes locked forward, ears perked but calm. To anyone else, he looked like a loyal German shepherd waiting for the next command. But Eleanor, who had been watching him for weeks, saw something deeper. His gaze had not wavered from Victor Hale, and his growl, though brief, still lingered in her mind like the echo of a warning. Victor Hale had retreated to his seat, his silver ring flashing under the courtroom lights. He tugged at his tie, his hands fidgeting more than usual. He tried to appear composed, but the cracks in his armor were showing. Eleanor's throat tightened. It wasn't just Atlas sensing him. It was the way the air itself seemed to bend around Hale. As the courtroom emptied into hushed pockets of conversation, Prosecutor Morales gathered his files, jaw set in a way Eleanor had not seen before. The usually unshakable Morales looked as if the ground beneath him had shifted. He gave a quick nod to his assistant, then caught Eleanor's eyes for the briefest moment. "Stay close to him," Morales murmured, tipping his head toward Atlas. "He's more than a dog in this trial." Eleanor only nodded, blinking back the sting in her eyes. She knew it already. Outside the courtroom doors, the corridor buzzed with tension. Families clutched their coats, journalists whispered into recorders, and bailiffs kept wary watch over the press who lingered. Heartbeat. Waiting for them near the end of the corridor was Detective Ryan McAdams, his broad frame leaning against the wall, arms crossed, eyes already scanning Morales's expression before a word was spoken. "Tell me you saw it," Morales said without preamble, his voice low but intense. McAdams uncrossed his arms, pushing away from the wall. "I saw it." His eyes flickered briefly toward Eleanor, then to Atlas, who was sitting, tail flicking once against the floor. The dog didn't just growl. He recognized something. "That ring?" Morales nodded sharply. "Exactly. Lila's testimony about the man with the silver ring wasn't some invention of trauma. And Hale's reaction, he's unraveling faster than I thought.
The detective's jaw tightened, his voice dropping. "This isn't just about that fight in the alley, Morales. You know it, and I know it. If Hale's tied to the Carters—" Eleanor's breath caught. She clutched the strap of her bag tighter, the name cutting through her like glass. The Carters. That family's name had haunted the background of whispers in Oak Ridge for years, their deaths written off as tragic, suspicious, yet buried so deep under official reports that no one dared question the narrative. Morales lowered his voice even further, glancing, to ensure no ears lingered nearby. "That's why I called you, Ryan. We need to reopen it. The Carter deaths were never what they seemed. If Hale was there that night—" McAdams's fists clenched, his knuckles pale. "We're talking about more than negligence. We're talking cover-up. Someone high up signed off to bury that case. You realize what kind of storm you're asking me to walk into?" The prosecutor's eyes burned with conviction. "I'm not asking you to walk into it. I'm telling you this. If we don't dig, this trial is nothing but a show. Hale knows something, and Atlas knows it too. That dog reacted because he remembers." Atlas, as if on cue, lifted his head, ears forward. His gaze locked once again on the corridor doors, where Hale had vanished moments ago, as though sensing the stain of his presence through walls. The detective's stare softened briefly as he looked at the German shepherd. "That's no ordinary animal." Eleanor found her voice, quiet but steady. "Atlas was there. He saw what we didn't. If you ignore that, then what's the point of calling this justice?" Her words hung in the air, delicate but sharp, and Morales gave her the faintest nod of approval. She had spoken what he could not. McAdams exhaled through his nose, his shoulders tense. He glanced between the prosecutor, Eleanor, and the dog who sat like a sentinel at her feet. Finally, he spoke. "All right, I'll pull the Carter files, quietly. But understand me, if Hale's— we walk into it together." The detective studied him, searching his face for doubt, and found none. He gave a slow nod, resolving settling in his eyes like stone. The storm outside rattled the glass panes, a low growl of thunder rolling overhead. Somewhere deep in Eleanor's chest, fear warred with relief. For the first time, the silence around the Carters was beginning to break. Atlas pressed his head gently against her hand, grounding her, as if to remind her she wasn't walking into this darkness alone. And in that fragile moment, in the echo of the storm and the hushed tension of the courthouse, hope flickered, faint but alive. Something far larger than anyone had dared to admit was surfacing, and Atlas, the dog once thought broken, was about to lead them straight to it. The basement smelled of dust and mothballs, the air so still that each step Eleanor took seemed to stir ghosts from another time. A single bulb swung above her, casting frail light across stacked boxes that bore her late husband's careful handwriting. It had been years since she'd ventured down here. Too many memories, too much pain. But tonight, after what she had seen in court, after hearing the name Victor Hale, her instincts pushed her where she had long been afraid to go. Eleanor descended the final step, her hand brushing the wooden rail. The beam of light illuminated a wall of old file boxes, each labeled in her husband's neat block script. Carter case, vehicle reports, crash scene photos, witness statements. She froze, her breath catching. He had kept everything. For years, Harold McAdams had worked tirelessly as a field investigator, documenting details others overlooked. He died suddenly, a heart attack, they said, leaving Eleanor with unanswered questions and a house heavy with silence. But now, standing in the basement, she felt as though he were guiding her back toward something he hadn't finished. Her fingers trembled as she tugged one of the boxes forward. Dust coated the cardboard, and when she lifted the lid, a puff rose into the air, like ash from a long dead fire. Inside were manila folders, brittle at the edges, filled with reports, clippings, and Polaroids that had yellowed with time. She sat down on an old wooden chair, the bulb above her humming faintly. She opened the first folder. Vehicle Analysis, Carter Crash, 2003. Notes in Harold's handwriting ran down the margins, sharp and precise. Brake lines severed, not consistent with roadside debris. Fuel leakage patterns staged. Eleanor's throat tightened. These weren't just the standard conclusions she'd once been told, the official story about a tragic accident. These were suspicions, questions her husband had never been able to lay to rest. One file slipped from her lap and fluttered to the floor. She bent to retrieve it, her eyes catching on words scrawled in ink, underlined twice. Victor Hale, present before police.
Dropped. She read the note again, slower this time, her pulse hammering in her ears. Harold had recorded that Hale, already a powerful figure back then, had been seen near the crash site before first responders arrived. No explanation, no official reason, just his presence, and beside it, Harold's unrelenting question. Why? Eleanor's hands shook as she turned another page. The leather-bound notebook, tucked beneath a stack of receipts, fell into her lap. It was Harold's field book, one he never left behind during investigations. The cover was cracked with age, but inside, the entries were alive with ink and urgency. She flipped through, pages filled with coordinates, dates, witness names. Then she stopped. A passage leapt out at her, one written in hurried strokes. Silver ring, distinctive crest, falcon motif. Witness claimed man wore it while standing near wreck. Matches Hale. Ring noted multiple times. Eleanor pressed a hand over her mouth. Her heart raced as she whispered into the empty basement, "Dear God, Harold, you knew." The mention of the ring, the same detail Lila had uttered in court just hours ago, wasn't coincidence. It was corroboration. Buried in Harold's old files, waiting to surface. She read further. Harold had been cautious, even fearful in his notes. Surveillance request denied. Case abruptly closed. Evidence sealed. His last entry, about the Carter crash, ended with 3 words that chilled her. Too powerful. Watching. The bulb overhead flickered, making shadows leap across the basement walls. Eleanor pulled the notebook close to her chest, as if shielding it from unseen eyes. She could almost feel her husband's presence, his quiet determination, his refusal to let corruption bury the truth. Her gaze swept across the stacks of boxes. How many secrets had Harold hidden here? How many threads had he been forced to abandon? The files weren't just paper and ink. They were pieces of a puzzle that stretched years into the past. Pieces that someone like Victor Hale had worked very hard to keep hidden. From upstairs came a faint creak. House settling or something more? Eleanor froze, listening. The basement door remained closed, but her nerves prickled. She knew better than to ignore Harold's warning scrawled in those pages. Watching. She slid the notebook into her cardigan pocket and began gathering a smaller stack of files. The ones that mentioned Hale, the ring, the inconsistencies. She couldn't carry them all, but she could bring enough to show Morales, enough to push Detective Ryan further. When she closed the box, her eyes lingered on the handwriting one last toward the basement floor, like hands reluctant to let her go. At the top of the stairs, she paused. For years she had avoided this place, too afraid of the grief it held. But now, grief was replaced by fire. Every page she had touched confirmed it. The Carter crash wasn't an accident, and Hale
wasn't innocent. She switched off the basement light, shutting the door with a quiet click. In her pocket, Harold's notebook pressed against her side, warm despite its cold leather cover. The truth was heavier than she imagined, but for the first time in years, Eleanor felt strong enough to carry it, and she knew this was only the beginning. The basement light flickered once, then steadied into its usual dim glow. Eleanor sat hunched over the leather notebook she had found, its spine cracked, its pages brittle with time and dust. Her fingers, veined and trembling, traced the indentation of Daniel's handwriting, as though by touching the ink she could reach across the years and feel him again. Her chest tightened. She closed her eyes, and before she could stop it, the past rose unbidden, carrying her back to a night long buried, but never forgotten. It had been late, close to midnight, when she heard the old truck's tires crunch across the gravel driveway. Daniel rarely came home that late unless a case had kept him out longer than expected. Eleanor had been sitting in the living room, half asleep with a book in her lap, the faint glow of the lamp pooling on the rug. The door creaked open, and there he was, Daniel Anderson, broad-shouldered, still in his rumpled shirt, his face carved with lines of fatigue. But it wasn't just exhaustion she saw that night. It was something deeper, sharper. His eyes had the haunted look of a man carrying a truth too heavy for words. "Daniel," she whispered, sitting up. "What happened?" He set his briefcase down too roughly, the clasp snapping against the wood. For a moment, he didn't answer. He just stood there, one hand braced against the wall, as though the weight on his shoulders threatened to fold him in two. Then he said it, his voice low, ragged. "Something's off." Eleanor frowned. "Off?" He nodded, sinking into the armchair across from her. His hands rubbed together, restless, like he was trying to scrub away the residue of whatever he had seen. "The Anderson crash," he said finally. "It doesn't sit right." Her breath caught. Everyone in Oak Ridge County had heard about it by then. A tragedy. The Carter family was gone in an instant. Before the coroner, before me. Tell me how that makes sense. Eleanor felt a chill creep along her arms. "A lawyer?" "Victor Hale," Daniel muttered, as though the name itself left a bitter taste. Walking the scene like he owned it, silver ring on his hand, catching the light. He was there before the fire was even out. She remembered the way Daniel's eyes had darted toward the window that night, as if half expecting someone was listening, someone who shouldn't be. He had always been cautious, but that night his caution bordered on paranoia. "Daniel," she whispered, "are you saying it wasn't an accident?" His jaw tightened. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he pressed a hand to his temple, sighing like a man who knew too much, but also knew the danger of speaking it aloud. "All I know," he murmured, "is the pieces don't fit. Someone wanted it wrapped up clean, too clean. And Hale," he shook his head, "Hale shouldn't have been there." The memory dissolved, but its echo clung to her chest like smoke. Eleanor opened her eyes, blinking against the sting of tears. The basement returned, the boxes, the dust, the faint hum of the old freezer. Yet Daniel's words lingered, as though he'd spoken them a moment ago. "Something's off," she whispered the words now, her lips trembling. How had she forgotten? Or had she simply buried it, too broken by his illness to hold on to suspicions he never had the chance to prove?
Daniel had carried that burden until the cancer silenced him. His final days consumed by pain, the mystery of the Carter crash lost in the shadow of his decline. But now it was back, alive in her hands, etched into the leather notebook, and the scrawled notes about skid marks, inconsistencies, and a name she knew too well: Victor Hale. Her breath hitched as she remembered the trial earlier that day. Hale, red-faced, objecting furiously, his voice rising, but his eyes betraying something else: fear, guilt, a crack in the mask. And then Atlas, that magnificent German shepherd, growling low, his gaze locked not on Hale's face, but on the glint of silver at his hand. The ring. Daniel had noticed it all those years ago, and now the dog had noticed too. Eleanor pressed her palm flat against the notebook, as though Daniel's voice might rise from the pages, guiding her toward the truth he never had the strength to uncover. "I see it now, Daniel," she whispered into the stillness. "You were right. You were right all along." The tears came then, hot and unstoppable, sliding down her cheeks, not just tears of grief, but of resolve. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt something stir inside her besides loss, a fragile but burning sense of duty. Daniel had carried the suspicion. Now she would carry the whatever Victor Hale had hidden that night. Whatever power had allowed him to stride across a crash site before the embers had cooled, she would not let it remain buried. Not now. Not after everything. And as she clutched the notebook to her chest, Eleanor realized that the story was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The basement was colder than usual that evening, as if the weight of what Eleanor had uncovered had drawn every last trace of warmth from the stone walls. Dust floated in pale shafts of light from the single bare bulb above, and the leather-bound notebook trembled slightly in her hands, not from the draft, but from her own frailty. She traced the worn spine with her fingertips. This was Daniel's. His handwriting filled the pages in steady ink, the lines crowded with questions, suspicions, fragments of names and dates. His voice seemed to linger between each line, murmuring from beyond the grave. She could almost hear him say it again. "Something's off. They think it's an accident, but accidents don't leave this kind of silence behind." Her knuckles stiffened as she turned another page, arthritis clawing up her fingers like an unwelcome reminder of time's cruelty. But pain meant little now. What mattered was what she held. The missing piece, the echo of her husband's unfinished pursuit. Daniel had carried doubts to his last breath. Now she carried them for him. Eleanor shut the notebook gently, the leather creaking like an old door closing on memory. She pressed it against her chest, as though by doing so she could hold Daniel himself again. Her heart ached, not just with loss, but with resolve. Somewhere above her head life went on, cars on the street, laughter from a neighbor's television. But down here, in the dim light of this basement, the truth lay waiting to be spoken aloud. A soft sound broke the silence, the shuffle of paws on the cement. Atlas, the German shepherd, had followed her down without a sound. His amber eyes found hers, and in that gaze Eleanor felt something uncanny, something steady. He padded forward and lowered his head onto her lap, the weight both grounding and comforting. She ran a trembling hand over his fur. "You feel it too, don't you, boy?" she whispered, her voice cracking. Atlas did not move, save for the slow press of his breath against her skirt, as if answering with presence alone. Tears blurred her vision, but they weren't the fragile tears of despair. They were tears of a woman who understood what was being asked of her, even if no words had been spoken. Daniel had left a trail,
She was the one left standing to carry it forward. Her arthritic hands protested as she tried to close the lid of the box, but she forced it down.
"You, Daniel," she whispered into the basement's hollow silence. "I'll make sure they do, no matter what it costs me." Atlas gave a low rumble of a sound, not threatening, not restless, but almost like a vow uttered in canine form. Eleanor let her hand rest on his head, drawing strength from the silent pact between them. Her mind flickered through what lay ahead, the courtroom heavy with the weight of procedure and indifference, the sharp eyes of lawyers who would dismiss her as just a widow clinging to shadows. The impatience of a judge who might call her grief clouded judgment. And yet, what she carried could not be dismissed so easily. Names, details, a note in Daniel's sure hand. Victor Hale on scene. Another, ring detail, unexplained. She didn't know exactly what it meant, but she knew enough to understand its value. The world had overlooked Daniel's whispers before, but she would not allow them to be buried again. She was no detective, no lawyer, no soldier like her husband once had been. She was simply Eleanor Hayes, a widow with aching bones and fading eyesight. But grief had a way of sharpening resolve. Atlas shifted closer, pressing his body against her leg. She leaned into him, finding in his silent company the courage she lacked in her own chest. "We'll do this together," she murmured, brushing her thumb across the raised letters of the notebook cover. "For him, for the truth." For a moment she closed her eyes, letting herself imagine Daniel sitting across from her once more, his hands ink-stained, his brow furrowed as he scrawled notes long into the night. He would lift his gaze, that weary but unbroken look, and he would smile faintly at her before returning to his work. It was that image she carried now more than the pain of watching cancer steal him away. This was how she would remember him, not diminished, but relentless, alive in pursuit of what was right. When she opened her eyes again, something in her had shifted. The frail woman in the cardigan had been replaced, in spirit, if not in body, by someone steadier, steelier. Eleanor slid the notebook into her worn handbag, the clasp clicking shut with finality. "Come on, Atlas," she said, her voice firmer now, cutting through the dust-laden air. "We have a court to return to." The shepherd rose at once, ears pricking as if he too recognized the significance of the moment. Together they climbed the basement stairs, each step creaking beneath their combined weight. The bulb swayed gently above them, casting long shadows that stretched behind, like echoes of the past, urging them forward. At the top of the stairs, Eleanor paused, one hand gripping the rail. Her breath came heavy, her joints screamed, but her spirit burned with clarity. She thought again of Daniel's words on those weary nights after Anderson's crash. Something's off. Yet the door opened with a groan, spilling warm light into the darkness behind her. Atlas pressed close at her side, his presence as steady as Daniel's memory in her heart. Together the widow and dog stepped back into the world above, no longer burdened, but armed, with love, with loyalty, with truth, waiting to be spoken. And for the first time since she had lost him, Eleanor felt not just grief but purpose. The conference room inside the Oak Ridge County Courthouse had gone still, the day's legal storm leaving only dust motes drifting in slanted sunlight. Eleanor sat at one end, Kane resting nearby, her late husband Daniel's leather-bound notebook lying like a relic before her. Detective Harlan Stone rubbed his temples across from her, exhausted by the case's growing knots. Then the door creaked open. A tall man in a dark suit entered, calm and sharp as a scalpel. "Special Agent Marcus DeLeon, FBI," he said, flipping his badge with practiced ease. He glanced toward the notebook before taking his seat. "You said you've tied Hale to multiple accidental deaths," DeLeon said, already pulling up encrypted files on his laptop. Eleanor nodded, voice firm despite age.
Daniel saw something in Anderson's crash. Said it didn't add up. He wrote Hale's name more than once. DeLeon brought up records, offshore accounts, shell companies, payout delays. Every time a cop dies, accidentally, Hale profits. Families were pressured, claims delayed. It's systematic. Harlan swore under his breath. He's managing grief like a portfolio. Eleanor pushed the notebook forward. Daniel was dying, but he never stopped being a cop. He saw this coming. DeLeon flipped through it, precise notes, sketches, Hale's name circled repeatedly. This could hold up in court, he muttered. At Eleanor's feet, Atlas lifted his head. DeLeon gave a faint smile. He knows what's at stake. I won't let them silence what Daniel found, Eleanor said. DeLeon looked up. If Anderson's case matches the pattern, we're looking at murder disguised as tragedy. The words struck like a bell. Eleanor closed her eyes, Daniel's voice echoing. Something's off. He'd been right. Now the truth clawed toward daylight. If you're going after Hale, she said, steel in her voice, I stand with you. DeLeon nodded, but it won't be easy. He's protected, politically, legally. Eleanor didn't blink. Storms don't scare me anymore. I've already lived through the worst one. They sat in silence, a widow, an agent, and a dog who refused to look away, waiting for the storm that was coming. The courtroom had never been quieter. The air hung heavy as Lila took the stand. So small, her feet didn't touch the floor. Yet her presence shifted the room's gravity. Atlas padded beside her, settling beneath the bench like a...
Eleanor clutched her rosary behind the prosecution table. DeLeon stopped writing. Everyone listened. Lila's voice was soft but clear. I remember my mom crying. A man came to our kitchen. He wore a thick gold ring with a black stone. He told her to sign papers. What did he say? The prosecutor asked gently. Lila hesitated. That if she didn't sign, we'd lose everything. That the insurance would cover us. Gasps murmured through the room. Hale's jaw clenched at the defense table. He tapped the ring on the table. Tap, tap, tap. Like time was running out. After she signed, Maria Ramirez died in what had been called an accident. Now the words fell like hammers on a brittle mask. DeLeon leaned over to the prosecutor. That ring, Hale wears one. We've got him in photos. The jury leaned in. Hale shifted. Then Lila's voice rang out, aimed at Hale. You scared my mom. You made her cry. I won't forget that. A ripple moved through the crowd. Even the jurors reacted. How do you feel saying this now? The prosecutor asked. Lila looked toward Eleanor, then to Atlas. Like my mom can rest. Like she wanted me to say it, even if it took a long time. Judge Morales thanked her. The gallery did not return to order. Something had shifted. It was no longer a case, it was a reckoning. Outside, reporters waited, but inside the courtroom braced for collapse. The prosecution laid out the rest: Hale's financial trail, offshore accounts, manipulated insurance claims, payoffs. Each detail stacked like bricks in a wall of guilt. Hale sat silent, jaw rigid, face ghost pale. Then the moment snapped. He stood. This is absurd, he shouted. You condemn me on a child's word and a mangy dog's growl? His voice cracked with panic and fury. The courtroom froze. Even the court reporter paused. Lila flinched, but Atlas rose. The German shepherd stepped forward, hackles raised, growling low, not as threat, but as warning. Protective, unyielding. Hale faltered. The dog didn't move. The judge rapped her gavel. Mr. Hale, control yourself. But Hale couldn't. That girl was coached. That mutt was trained. This is a circus. The jurors stared.
stunned not by the outburst, but by its raw unraveling. Lila steadied. She reached down and touched Atlas's fur, grounding herself in his calm. She didn't cry. She sat tall. The prosecutor stood slowly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice clear, deliberate, "ask yourself, who here looks more like the truth? The child who's remained steady? The dog?" Together. Eleanor nodded. "They always say children should be protected, but sometimes they're the ones who protect us." Outside, Oak Ridge County braced for rain. Inside, a woman's quiet strength, a dog's loyalty, and a girl's unwavering voice had brought an empire to its knees. Justice wasn't loud. It didn't always wear robes or carry gavels. Sometimes it whispered through grief. Sometimes it barked in warning. And sometimes it spoke in the unshakable memory of a little girl who refused to forget. A murmur spread among the jury box. The foreman's lips tightened, his eyes narrowing as if to say the argument had already been settled in his mind. Hale, realizing he had overplayed his hand, tried to reel himself back in. He smoothed his tie with trembling fingers, forced a smile that looked more like a grimace. "Forgive me," he said, voice strained. "This is all very emotional, but I assure you, I am innocent." But the damage had been done. Everyone in that room had seen the raw edge of his soul, unfiltered, exposed. The jurors had seen the wolf beneath the sheep's clothing. Atlas eased back onto his haunches, but his eyes never left Hale. His growl faded, replaced by that unnerving silence dogs possess when their judgment is final. It was as if he, too, had delivered his verdict. Judge Whitaker leaned forward, her voice measured but firm. "Mr. Hale, this court will not tolerate intimidation. Your behavior today speaks volumes, and it will not be forgotten." The widow Eleanor sat in the gallery, clutching her cane in one hand and the precious notebook in the other. A tear slipped down her cheek, not from fear, but from vindication. She whispered to herself, almost a prayer, "They see him now. They finally see him." Hale slumped back into his chair, but his eyes darted, wild and desperate, towards the jurors. He knew, they knew. In the quiet that followed, Leela's small voice broke through, not rehearsed, not dramatic, just honest. "He yelled at my mom that way, before she signed the papers." The room froze. The words, simple and soft, landed heavier than any cross-examination. Hale's attorney put his head in his hands. Atlas pressed closer against Leela's legs, his body a warm wall between her and the man who had caused so much suffering. She stroked his ears gently, a child comforting her guardian as much as he comforted her. The prosecutor spoke again, but softer this time, certain. Hale had cornered himself. The conference room at the federal field office was dimly lit, its walls lined with whiteboards and corkboards pinned with photographs, printouts, and maps. The air smelled faintly of dry coffee and printer ink, a place where sleepless nights had been stacked on top of one another. Marcus de Leon stood at the head of the table, his tie loosened, his sleeves rolled to the elbow. Detective Morales sat across from him, tapping a pen against her notepad, her sharp eyes locked on the growing constellation of evidence spread before them. On the central board, at least 15 photographs of fallen officers stared back, faces once etched with duty and life, now reduced to cold portraits under the harsh glow of a desk lamp. Each photo was marked with red pins, thin strings of twine connecting them like veins in a malignant organism. The more they tugged at the lines, the more the picture began to take shape. "It isn't just Hale," De Leon said quietly, almost to himself. This is systemic." Morales leaned forward, her voice carrying both frustration and disbelief. 15 officers, all declared line-of-duty accidents, car wrecks, faulty brakes, house fires, gas leaks, each one followed by delayed insurance payouts that trace back to Hale's brokerage. And every time a sliver of the money disappears into offshore accounts under shell corporations. De Leon pinched the bridge of his nose. He'd worked corruption cases for years, but this one was different. It wasn't some lone official pocketing favors. It was an entire network feeding off the dead. "The question is," he said, lowering his hand, "how high does it go?" Morales stood, unable to stay seated any longer, and crossed to the board. She tapped her pen against a photo of Officer Delgado, a patrolman killed in what had been ruled a freak electrical fire. "Here's the thing. Delgado had been investigating falsified overtime records tied to the deputy mayor's office. That case got buried the second he died." She moved to another photo. Officer Ramos, allegedly killed in a hit-and-run. "And Ramos? He filed a complaint about improper contracts for body armor procurement. Same story. He's dead, the case dies with him." De Leon nodded grimly. The pattern was undeniable. So Hale isn't just profiting off these deaths. He's part of a machine designed to silence anyone who steps out of line. The words hung in the room like smoke. Atlas shifted from his place near the door, his ears flicking as though he sensed the weight of what was being spoken. Even the dog seemed to understand that the air carried something poisonous. Morales turned back to De Leon. "We need warrants, subpoenas, everything. If Hale's tied to district officials, then we've got obstruction, conspiracy, maybe even racketeering. But the moment we pull the trigger, they'll know we're coming." De Leon crossed his arms, staring at the mess
Of photos and documents. "We can't just hit them head-on, not yet. If this web runs through City Hall, the courts, the insurance firms, we don't know who's clean and who's compromised." Morales exhaled slowly, then dropped back into her chair. "So what's the play?" For a moment, silence pressed down on the room, broken only by the hum of the air vent. De Leon finally spoke. "We use what we have. Hale is sloppy. His arrogance makes him predictable. He thought no one would ever dig deeper than the paperwork. But now we've got financial transfers, time-stamped emails, and testimony that ties Maria's death directly to his schemes. That's leverage." He pulled a folder from the stack and slid it across the table. Morales opened it, her brow furrowing. It was a list of names, local judges, clerks, city council members, and contractors. Each one was circled, arrows drawn between them like a lattice. "All of these," De Leon said, pointing with a blunt finger, "had financial transactions traceable back to Hale's network. Some got campaign donations, others had their debts mysteriously erased. A few are sitting on property conveniently undervalued for taxes. Every thread we pull makes the knot tighter." Morales scanned the list, her lips pressing into a thin line. "So this isn't just about lining pockets, it's about control. Hale and his partners built a system where loyalty is bought and silence is enforced. And the ones who wouldn't play along," she gestured toward the board of faces, "they ended up dead." The room grew colder. De Leon's jaw tightened as he studied the photographs again. He saw fathers, mothers, partners, all erased so that men like Hale could grow fat off insurance blood money. His gut churned with a mixture of rage and grim determination. "They thought they could hide behind bureaucracy," De Leon said softly, almost like a vow. "But people like Maria, like Lila, they're the cracks in the wall. The truth leaks out." Morales nodded slowly. "And now we're the flood." Just then, the door creaked open, and a young analyst slipped inside with a stack of printouts. She looked nervous,
as though stepping into the room meant crossing some invisible threshold. "Agent De Leon, you'll want to see this." She handed him the papers. His eyes scanned the top sheet, his face darkening as he read. Offshore transfers, dates matching almost perfectly with the deaths of every officer on the board. And at the bottom, a name that froze his blood, Judge Everett Harland. Morales caught the shift in his expression. "What is it?" De Leon slid the page across the table. "It's worse than we thought. One of the presiding judges who ruled on Hale's previous civil suits, he's in on it too, which means the courtroom itself could be compromised."
Fighting a corrupt broker. They were staring down an entire system willing to bury the truth under bodies and paperwork. Atlas let out a low growl, his hackles rising as though he could sense the invisible enemy tightening its grip. De Leon clenched his fist. "Then we don't just go after Hale, we go after the network, one thread at a time until the whole thing unravels." Morales' eyes hardened with resolve. "And we make sure Lila's voice is the one that can't be silenced." The board loomed over them, 15 dead officers staring from their paper graves. But for the first time, De Leon and Morales could see the pattern not as an endless labyrinth, but as a path leading straight to the heart of corruption. And this time, they weren't turning back. The courtroom smelled faintly of bleach and old wood polish, the kind of sterile scent that clung to every corner of justice. But the air that morning felt heavier, charged with the unspoken expectation that another piece of the puzzle would finally fall into place. At precisely 9 a.m., 2 deputies escorted a shackled man through the double doors. His wrists gleamed with steel, his orange jumpsuit stiff and wrinkled, and his face, creased with years of violence, was one that had haunted Sarah's nightmares since the attack. Richard Monroe, Hale's hired enforcer, shuffled forward, the chains between his ankles scraping against the tile. The room bristled with tension. Jurors shifted uneasily in their seats. Sarah's hand resting on the table curled into a fist, and beside her chair, Atlas stood, ears pricked, his gaze fixed on the man as though instinct alone recognized the predator entering their midst. Judge Wexler's voice broke the silence. "Mr. Monroe, you've requested to testify. Is that correct?" Monroe's jaw flexed. His voice, gravelly and low, carried across the hushed courtroom. "Yeah, that's correct." The prosecutor, De Leon, rose slowly, his eyes measuring the man. "For the record, Mr. Monroe, you are currently serving time for aggravated assault and conspiracy to obstruct justice. You've admitted your connection to Edward Hale. Today, you claim you have new information to provide. Is that correct?" Monroe nodded, his chains clinking softly. "I didn't come here to play games. I'm done carrying water for Hale. He used me, same as everyone else." Sarah's breath caught. She could hear her pulse pounding in her ears. Her mind replayed the night she was dragged into that alley, the flash of Monroe's face above her, the choking silence when she realized no one was coming, then parted. "I was told to shut her up." A ripple of gasps moved through the jury box. "Clarify," De Leon pressed. Monroe's eyes darted toward Hale, who sat stiffly at the defense table, his polished suit unable to mask the fury in his eyes. Monroe looked back at the prosecutor. Hale knew Sarah was digging too close, knew she was about to uncover where the money trail led, the papers, the offshore accounts she was circling in. "He told me to make sure she wouldn't testify, not ever."
Sarah felt her chest constrict, but she refused to look away. Each word was another weight lifted from her silence, another truth pulled into the light. DeLeon leaned in, and one about Lila Bennett. For the first time, Monroe's hardened mask cracked. His gaze dropped and his voice softened. The girl, she was next. Hale said kids talk too much when they're scared. Said if Sarah didn't keep quiet, he'd handle it another way. Monroe swallowed hard. He had me follow them once, told me to wait for his signal. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, disbelief spilling through the benches like wildfire. Judge Wexler slammed his gavel. "Order!" Atlas let out a low growl, the sound vibrating like a warning drum through the floorboards. He had shifted closer to Lila, his body planted firmly between her and Monroe, as though he understood the weight of every word. The girl reached down, her small hand brushing the thick fur along Atlas's neck, her eyes wide but steady. DeLeon's voice cut through the noise, measured and precise. "Mr. Monroe, are you testifying here today under coercion, or is this your voluntary statement?" "Voluntary," Monroe rasped. "I'm not doing it for a deal. I'm doing it because I've seen what Hale does to people who stand in his way. Good men, cops, families, doesn't matter. He chews 'em up, spits 'em out. I've been his hammer for too long. I'm done." He looked toward Sarah then, and for the first time, there was something like shame in his eyes. "I can't undo what I did to you, but I can stop him from hurting anyone else." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. DeLeon gave a slow nod, his voice lowering with gravity. "So you're saying Edward Hale orchestrated not only financial fraud, but ordered physical attacks, intimidation, attempted silencing, against witnesses like Sarah Bennett and her daughter Lila?" Monroe's reply was firm, final. "Yes, every word of it." Hale shot to his feet, slamming a hand against the table. "Lies, all of it." His voice cracked with a venom that rattled the rafters. "You'd believe a thug in chains over me. This is a circus." Atlas barked sharply, his teeth bared, and the deputies moved instantly to Hale's side, pressing him back into his chair. Shoulder. The little girl leaned against Atlas, whispering so softly, only the dogs seemed to hear. "We're safe now." For the first time in weeks, Sarah almost believed it. Monroe slumped in the witness chair, the chains rattling like an old ghost finally giving up its hold. The truth had cracked open, spilling into the light, and though it didn't erase the scars, it carved a path forward, toward justice, toward accountability, toward an end to the silence that had nearly consumed them all. The storm outside rattled the courthouse windows, a steady rumble of thunder rolling across the sky as though nature itself demanded judgment. Rain streaked down the tall panes, streaking the light inside into fractured shards across the wooden floor. The room was already thick with tension, the kind that prickled skin and made breaths shallow, when Eleanor Shaw rose from her seat at the prosecution table. Her hand rested on the worn leather notebook, the one that had passed through blood, fire, and silence before finding its way here. Daniel's notebook, the final testament of a man who had died chasing the truth. Eleanor drew a breath, steady but deliberate, and turned to face the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice low but sharp as glass, "we've heard from witnesses, seen the evidence, and listened to Hale himself attempt to deny the undeniable. But today, you will see what his empire feared most, the words of a man who refused to bow, even when it cost him his life." She held the notebook aloft, and the room seemed to lean toward it as though it carried weight beyond paper and ink. Judge Warner, a stern figure under his black robes, gave a single nod. "Proceed." The bailiff took the notebook carefully, gloves in place, and handed it to the clerk. Eleanor's eyes flicked across the room, watching Hale. For the first time, the mask he had worn so flawlessly was beginning to slip. His shoulders, once squared in defiance, sagged slightly. His jaw twitched. Monroe's earlier testimony still lingered in the air like smoke from a gunshot. His voice, gravelly from years of cigarettes and violence, had painted the picture clearly. I was hired to silence her. Sarah. The orders came straight from Hale. And the girl, Lila, she wasn't supposed to make it either. Hale didn't want survivors. Just shadows. That admission had cracked the dam. Now, with the notebook, Eleanor intended to break it wide open. The clerk opened the leather cover, carefully turning the first page. Eleanor nodded. "Page 72, she instructed, her voice unwavering. The clerk read aloud, each word cutting through the courtroom like a blade. "Hale's network extends deeper than I feared. District officials, police captains, even federal liaisons are tied to him. 15 officers dead in incidents that don't align with the evidence. Patterns emerge, but each lead vanishes before I can secure it. He knows I'm close. If I don't make it out, let this record bear the truth." The silence that followed was suffocating. Every eye turned to Hale, and for the first time the man who had smirked his way through weeks of testimony looked human. Sweat slicked his temples, despite the cool draft seeping in from the storm. His hands twitched against the polished oak of the defense table, and his lips pulled back in something between a snarl and a grimace. "This is nonsense!" Hale exploded, his voice cracking like a whip. He surged to his feet, pointing toward Eleanor. "You parade a dead man's scribbles and expect this court to treat it as fact? A child and a dog, those are your witnesses. This is a circus." The judge slammed his gavel once, the crack reverberating. "Sit down, Mr. Hale." But Hale didn't sit. He paced, shoulders hunched like a caged predator. His eyes darted to the jury, wide and desperate. "You can't convict me on this. It's fabrication, lies. They're all against me. The girl, that mutt, these corrupt officers, they want my empire because they can't build their own." Atlas growled from his place at Lila's side, the low rumble of thunder in canine form. The German shepherd's amber eyes locked onto Hale, unflinching, protective. His hackles rose, ears pinned, his body positioned like a living wall between Lila and the venom spilling across the courtroom. The jury flinched, not at Atlas, but at Hale. His rage, meant to intimidate, betrayed him instead. His words, meant to cast doubt, painted him exactly as Eleanor wanted, unhinged, dangerous, guilty. Eleanor let the silence stretch, her gaze steady. Then she stepped forward, her heels clicking on the wooden floor, her voice slicing clean through the chaos. "You just confirmed everything, Mr. Hale." The room froze. "You stand here screaming about a child and a dog," Eleanor continued, her tone calm but lethal. "But no one here ever said they could convict you alone. The evidence convicts you. The witnesses convicts you. Daniel's words convict you, and your own mouth, right now, convicts you. Because an innocent man doesn't fear a notebook. An innocent man doesn't need to shout down a child." Hale's face blanched. The storm outside cracked lightning so bright it painted the room in silver for a heartbeat. And when the thunder followed, it felt as though the heavens themselves rendered judgment. Judge Warner rapped the gavel again. "Order! Order in the court!" But the damage was done. Hale slumped into his seat, trembling despite his effort to mask it. His fingers drummed the table, frantic, as though tapping could summon an escape that no longer existed. The jury members exchanged glances, solemn, knowing. Eleanor closed Daniel's notebook gently, like lowering a flag. Her eyes lingered on it, then on Atlas, whose growl subsided only when Hale's gaze broke away from Lila. The storm in the courtroom had passed its peak, but its echoes remained. Hale had been cornered, not by guns, nor threats, but by truth itself. And truth, once spoken, had a way of filling every crack, every shadow, until nothing remained hidden. Eleanor stepped back to her table, sliding Daniel's notebook beside her files. Her fingers brushed its surface lightly, as though thanking the man who had paid the ultimate price to ensure these words would see daylight. And for the first time since the trial began, Lila allowed herself a breath she didn't know she had been holding. Her hand found Atlas's fur, gripping it tight. as his steady warmth reassured her. The worst storm had broken. But the trial was far from over. The ICU was a place designed to silence everything but the machines. Beeps echoed like borrowed heartbeats, each one tethering Sarah Carter to the edge of life. She lay beneath fluorescent lights, pale and motionless, a ventilator hissing beside her, its rhythm cruel but essential. Lila sat beside the bed, her small hand curled tightly around her mother's. Atlas, the massive German shepherd, lay pressed against the hospital bed, his amber eyes never wavering. Detective De Leon had warned gently, "She may not look like your mom right now, but she needs you." So Lila had climbed the too-tall chair and refused to let go. "Mommy, the bad people can't hurt us now," she whispered. Atlas's tail gave a slow sweep, catching her meaning. Outside, the world was unraveling, corruption exposed, arrests underway. But here, Lila's words were a fragile shield. Judge Eleanor stood near the doorway, arms crossed, her chest rising with a rhythm that belonged to warriors. She'd won in court, but this, the sight of Sarah, bruised and unconscious, was the true cost of justice. The monitor beeped, a small fluctuation. Lila's voice trembled. "Please don't leave me. I'll be good. Atlas and we'll take care of you." Tears soaked her mother's gown. Then Atlas rose. He placed a paw on the bed near Sarah's arm, eyes fixed, as if summoning her back. Eleanor's throat clenched. She'd broken liars on the stand, but nothing unraveled her like this. A child pleading, a dog standing guard. "She's stronger than any of us," Eleanor whispered. "She'll come back." Hours passed. Nurses came and went, whispering critical but stable. Lila didn't move. "Mommy," she whispered. They listened. "Mr. Hale can't hurt anyone now." She began to sing the lullaby Sarah once hummed to her. It was fragile and off-key, but honest. Atlas tilted his head, recognizing the tune, and rested his muzzle near Sarah's hand. Then it happened. Sarah's fingers twitched. "Mommy?" Lila gasped. "Sewn, not just to survival, but to healing." That night, long after the courthouse had emptied, Judge Margaret Grant remained in her chambers. Her robe hung behind her, her desk cluttered with the Haled case files. She wasn't searching for evidence, she was searching for strength. A silver-framed photo of her granddaughter Emily sat in the corner. Gone 10 years now, found by a riverbank. Justice never came. She touched the glass. "I couldn't save you." Lila's voice echoed in her mind. "The bad people can't hurt us now." Emily had been listening to music and sunlight. Her loss had hardened Grant, but tonight something cracked. The image of Lila clutching Atlas at Sarah's bedside pierced the armor. She stood at the window, palm to the cold glass. The courthouse square was nearly empty. "I couldn't save Emily," she murmured, "but I can protect this child." She returned to her desk and opened Daniel Carter's notebook, evidence and legacy in one. A father's desperate map left behind to shield his family. Grant's jaw tightened. This wouldn't disappear into the shadows, not on her watch. When the bailiff checked in, she dismissed him gently. Alone again, she whispered to Emily's photo, "Maybe helping her will be enough." She turned off the lamp. In the darkness, she no longer felt like stone. Not yet. The courtroom had learned silence, but this silence was different, reverent, expectant. Lila entered, holding Eleanor's sleeve, so small beneath the weight of the chamber. Atlas walked beside her, brushing her leg, a silent sentinel. Eleanor guided her to the witness stand. "Remember, sweetheart, Atlas is here. You're safe." Lila nodded, gripping the railing.
Her legs dangled above the floor. Atlas sat beneath her, grounding her. Judge Grant's voice was velvet. "Miss Lila Carter, do you understand why you're here?" "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor approached gently. "Can you tell us about your daddy?" Lila's eyes flicked toward Hale. He sat hunched, pale, trying to vanish. But Atlas nudged her leg. She took a breath. "Daddy was a good policeman. He told me, good policemen never look away." A ripple passed through the room. "And do you remember what happened to him?" Eleanor asked softly. Lila buried her hand in Atlas's fur. "He died trying to stop the bad men. He didn't want them to hurt Mommy. Or me." The jurors leaned in. Hale flinched. Eleanor knelt. "Do you remember anything else, Lila? Something that helps you feel sure?" Lila looked down, then pointed, not at Hale's face, but his hand. A ring gleamed faintly. "That," "And Daddy said truth is stronger than fear, so I'm not afraid anymore." Hale's composure fractured. His hand trembled against the table. The ring clinked audibly. Judge Grant tapped the gavel. "Let the record show the child's testimony has been heard." But everyone knew it was more than testimony. It was the echo of sacrifice, spoken through the voice of a daughter and witnessed by a dog who never forgot. Atlas rested his head fully on Lila's shoe. She bent forward and whispered, "Good boy, Atlas. We did it." And with that, the storm in the courtroom broke, not in violence, but in the quiet collapse of Hale's mask. His breath hitched, eyes wide with a realization that the walls had finally closed in. In that single day, across an ICU, a judge's chambers, and a courtroom, something sacred unfolded. Justice didn't roar. It whispered through a girl's song, a dog's memory, a grandmother's vow. The machines still beeped in Sarah's hospital room. The notebook still lay open on Judge Grant's desk, and Atlas, ever watchful, stood between past and future. But something had shifted. It wasn't just a case anymore. It was a reckoning. The courthouse carried a peculiar hush that morning, one thick with something unspoken. Detectives, clerks, and attorneys passed like shadows, their eyes pulled toward the locked conference room at the end of the hall. Inside, Councilman Victor Hale, once the epitome of authority, sat hollow-eyed, twisting a paper cup in trembling hands. His tailored suit now hung on him like regret. Across from him, two federal prosecutors waited. Agent Ramirez leaned against the wall, arms crossed. On the table between them, a stack of evidence, photos, reports, files, and a child's voice recorded in sworn testimony. Lila's voice, calm, unshaken. A child who had cut through decades of lies. "You've been given every opportunity, Councilman," one prosecutor said. "The window is closing. Help us or go down alone." Hale stared at the floor, unable to meet their eyes. Her words weren't threats, they were inevitabilities. He had known it since the day Lila spoke. Her truth shattered the armor he spent years building. Finally, his voice cracked the silence. "I can't keep this up." The words came not as confession, but surrender. "You don't understand. They never stop. If I talk—" Ramirez stepped forward. "If you don't talk, you're already finished." There was a pause. Then, like a man stepping into water too cold to bear, Hale whispered, "It wasn't just me." The accidents were orchestrated, vehicles tampered with, witnesses erased, deaths dressed up as coincidence. And Hale, he had signed off on them, believing it made him untouchable. "Who else?" the prosecutor asked. Penn's silence. By the time he finished, Hale sat crushed by the weight of his own truth. Ramirez nodded, not with approval, but acknowledgement. "You'll be placed in protective custody. But understand, no deal erases the blood you helped spill." Hale gave a broken laugh. Protective custody? They'll come anyway. But maybe it's enough that the girl can sleep without fear. For once he wasn't saving himself. He was saving someone else. By morning the courthouse steps erupted, not in violence, but in reckoning. Reporters shouted, cameras flashed, FBI agents led out men in suits, men who once defined power. Among them, Warren Kellerman, the district attorney, pale and slack-jawed. Microphones surged forward. "Did you authorize the cover-ups? What about the files on the dead officers? Do you deny working with Hale?" He said nothing, only glanced at the black SUVs waiting to bury him in silence. Inside FBI offices, agents pulled out box after box, case files, altered reports, surveillance photos, names redacted and then re-revealed. The crown jewel, a ledger listing problem officers and how to eliminate them. Among the names, Atlas, Frank Mitchell. The story exploded nationwide. Anchors interrupted regular programming. Viewers watched in disbelief as fallen officers' names were re-evaluated. Mothers wept, widows gripped faded photographs. And slowly the silence that had suffocated so many gave way to fury and validation. Judge Eleanor Grant, watching alone in her chambers, pressed her hands together. Her granddaughter's case had never been solved, but today something shifted. Arrests followed swiftly, assistant DAs, senior detectives, even a deputy chief. Faces once trusted with justice now paraded in shame. Some defiant, some are broken, some finally free of the weight of secrets. At a press conference, the U.S. attorney stood grim and resolute. This isn't just corruption, it's betrayal, and today justice begins its reckoning. The nation leaned in. The hashtag Justice for the Fallen ignited social media. But one image rose above the rest, Atlas, the German shepherd, sitting steady at Lila's feet in court. He became a symbol, not of vengeance, but of loyalty that couldn't be silenced. In Oak Ridge, Frank Mitchell stood at a makeshift memorial. Candles flickered, handwritten signs named the dead. A woman approached him. "Your partner gave us hope." Frank nodded. Words weren't necessary anymore. For years they'd called him broken. Now they called him right. Ripples turned to waves. Governors ordered reviews. Lawsuits surged. The Kellerman empire crumbled in days, but the grief it left behind would take plaintiffs, no defendants, just sons, widows, brothers and daughters, holding framed photos and folded flags. Lila sat in the front row, hand resting on Atlas's fur. Grace, alive but still healing, sat beside her in a wheelchair. She didn't need to speak. Her survival was declared enough. Judge Grant entered without her robe. No pomp, just purpose. "The courts have ruled. The truth has surfaced. Those responsible will face justice, not in whispers, but in daylight." She read the names, one by one, fallen officers, whose accidents were now understood as executions. For each name, a photo. When she reached Frank Carter, Atlas's partner, Grace closed her eyes. Lila whispered, "He's with the stars now." And then, something extraordinary happened. A woman stood. "They said my brother overdosed, but he called me the night before. He wasn't an addict, he was a cop." Others followed. "My husband's brakes didn't fail. My sister didn't fall. My father wasn't suicidal." Grief turned into testimony. Not for courts,
but for each other. Then Grace stood. I believed I was alone, that no one would believe me. But my daughter, she told the truth when it was dangerous. She paused. Now I ask all of you, don't stay silent. We owe it to the fallen. We owe it to the officers who still serve. We owe it to our children. People rose, not in applause, but in unity. A retired officer placed his badge on the bench. He died with this. Now the world knows why. A young woman limped forward. Her twin had been framed and killed. She handed over his only photo. Don't let them rewrite him again. They won't, Grant promised. Outside, the press stood back, not as reporters, but as witnesses. Near the steps, a boy approached Lila, clutching a photo. She was my mom, he whispered. They said she slipped, but she said people were following her. Before, he looked down, then back up. Thank you for being brave. Lila took his hand. Atlas leaned in, nuzzling the boy gently. At that moment, something shifted. It was no longer just a case. It was no longer just corruption. It was a movement, born from a girl's voice, a mother's survival, and the eyes of a dog who remembered everything. Giggled, her braids bouncing as she ran, chased half-heartedly by the old German shepherd who padded behind her like a living shadow. He wasn't as fast as he used to be, a little gray at the muzzle now, but he was still precise, still alert. His eyes tracked every movement of birds, of clouds, of the little girl he'd nearly died to protect. But today, he was off duty. Today was for remembering. At the center of the yard stood a small garden plot, ringed by smooth river stones and marigolds. And in its heart, beneath the protective canopy of a young magnolia tree, lay a stone. Clean, elegant, etched with care. In loving memory of David and Maria Carter. Truth never dies. It waits. Below the names was a brass inlay of 2 entwined olive branches, and in the corner, so small it could be missed unless one knew to look, was the outline of a badge and a paw print side by side. Lila had picked that detail. "That's for Daddy and Atlas," she'd said. Sarah had crouched beside her that day, gently correcting, "Atlas is still here, honey." "I know," Lila whispered, "but one day he'll be there too, and I want Daddy to have company." Now, 1 year later, Lila sat cross-legged beside the stone, a tiny notebook open on her knees. She scribbled carefully with a red crayon, her tongue between her teeth, in concentration. "What are you writing?" Sarah asked, stepping out with a pitcher of lemonade. "It's not writing," Lila replied, matter of fact. "It's a letter." Sarah paused. "To who?" "To Daddy and Grandma Maria. I tell them stuff." Atlas lowered himself beside the stone with a heavy sigh. His body curled like a sentinel statue, ever present, ever quiet. He rested his head near the base of the stone, nose almost touching the edge where Lila's drawings of stars and clouds had begun to fade with the rain. "They listen, you know," Lila added, still writing. "Sometimes when I read it out loud, the tree moves.
even when there's no wind." Sarah crouched beside her daughter, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Her eyes flicked toward the magnolia's branches. They trembled lightly in the still air. "I think they do," she said softly. They sat in silence for a while. Somewhere beyond the garden gate, life continued. Neighbors mowing lawns, a dog barking faintly down the street, the rhythmic sound of basketballs on asphalt. Going wild, even before David put the key in the lock, like he knew. "Like magic?" Lila asked. "No," Sarah said, "like love." They stayed a while longer, until the sun began to dip behind the rooflines and the breeze turned cool. Lila carefully folded her letter and tucked it into a small mason jar. With Sarah's help, she buried it under the edge of the magnolia's roots, right beside last spring's note and a small drawing of Atlas in a superhero cape. Sarah stood, brushing soil from her knees. "Ready for dinner?" "In a minute," Lila said. She turned and kissed the top of Atlas's head. He didn't stir, just let his eyes close slowly, as if lulled by the weight of the moment. "I love you, Atlas," she whispered. He blinked once, then nestled closer to the base of the memorial stone. And just before they went inside, Lila looked up at the tree one last time. Its branches swayed gently, and for a moment, just a moment, the world felt exactly right. The sunlight poured over the backyard like warm honey, casting long golden shadows across the grass that had finally grown thick again. It was a Saturday in late spring, and the world, for once, did not feel like it was holding its breath. Near the magnolia tree just beside the memorial stone for David and Maria Carter, a small blanket lay unfurled. It was covered in crayon-scrawled fairy tale books, scattered plush toys, and 4 small bundles of chaos, Atlas's puppies. Lila lay on her stomach, propped up on her elbows, book in hand. "And the brave knight," she read aloud, her voice earnest and slightly dramatic, "stood tall, even though he was scared, because courage," she glanced up to make sure the puppies were listening, "means doing the right thing, even when you're afraid." One of the pups, a black and tan fluffball with paws too big for his body, tumbled forward and bumped his head against her arm as if in applause. She giggled. "You'd totally be the knight, Pancake." "Pancake?" a voice called from the flower beds. Lila turned her head. "That's what I named him, 'cause he flopped a lot when he was born." At the rose bushes, Eleanor Hart laughed gently as she pruned the climbing vines near the white trellis. She wore a wide straw hat that shaded her face, but the lines around her eyes were soft now, not heavy with loss. Her hands, gloved and patient, moved with care, each rose clipped, each stem checked. Her garden had always been meticulous, but now it bloomed with something richer, meaning. The trellis arched above a bench, and the bench faced the stone, not as a shrine, but as part of life. "She's reading them the hero stories again," Eleanor called toward the porch. "She takes after her father," Judge Grant replied as she stepped onto the grass. First time anyone could remember. No badge, no tie, just a man with tired shoulders and a deep pride behind his eyes. Lila waved, then turned her focus back to the puppies. "I added a dragon this time," she told them conspiratorially. "But it's a nice dragon. He protects the kingdom, like Atlas did." The biggest of the pups barked once, startling himself, then pounced on a loose page. Lila grabbed it before his paws could crumple it, giggling. On the porch steps, De Leon took a seat, nodding toward the yard. "That kid, she saved more people than we ever will." Judge Grant followed his gaze. "She reminded us what justice is supposed to protect." He looked down at the thick folder in his hands, marked with gold seal,
and blue tabs. Senate Bill 914, the Carter Act. The judge's voice was quiet. Mandatory review of all officer deaths marked as accidental, back 10 years, and whistleblower protections for surviving family members. De Leon added, passed unanimously. Eleanor approached them, wiping her gloves. It's not just a law, it's a promise to the ones who didn't have someone like Lila to speak for them. They all looked toward the tree, where Atlas lay on his side, watching the pups with half-lidded eyes. His body bore the wisdom of age now, slower to rise but no less aware. Sarah had once said he seemed to carry memories in his bones. Watching his children now, he seemed almost content, as if he knew his purpose had passed into new pause. Eleanor knelt beside him and rubbed his ears. You did good, old boy. He let out a low, satisfied rumble. Inside the house, a wind chime sang softly in the hallway. Sarah's idea, a way to remember movement, even in silence. She's painting again, Eleanor said, glancing toward the windows. Every morning. Some days it's flowers. Some days it's stars. And you? Judge Grant asked gently. Eleanor's eyes misted for a beat, but she smiled. I plant, I prune, and I listen when Lila reads her stories. It's enough. De Leon stood, stretching. I still carry my badge, but it doesn't feel like armor anymore. It feels like responsibility. The judge nodded. And Atlas. Eleanor looked at the old shepherd, now surrounded by playful pups, one of them chewing his tail. He still guards the truth, she said, but now he guards it with peace. At that moment, Lila stood up, brushing grass off her dress. She picked up one of the smaller puppies and walked toward the adults. This one's going to be a service dog, she declared. I already started teaching him how to sit when someone's sad. Eleanor said seriously. Everyone laughed, quiet, warm, real. The sun began to tilt westward, draping the backyard in a halo of light. Shadows stretched long, but not ominous, just gentle reminders of what had passed and what remained. The garden whispered with bees. The wind didn't howl anymore. It danced, and in the heart of the backyard, where a stone bore names too brave to forget, the future played at their feet. The late afternoon light wrapped the backyard in a soft, amber warmth, like a final hush before the stars would slowly begin to blink open above. The garden behind the Carter home, once overgrown with silence and sorrow, was now alive with rustling leaves, blooming roses, and the joyful squeals of a child unburdened. Lila's laughter rang out like wind chimes caught in a summer breeze. She chased after Pancake and Button as they tumbled through the grass, their soft, puppy bodies rolling and yipping with delight. Atlas lay under the shade of the old magnolia tree, his head lifted just enough to watch them, eyes half closed in that way of old shepherds who'd seen too much, and yet still chose peace. Nearby, a picnic blanket lay strewn with storybooks and crayon drawings. One page fluttered free and drifted toward Atlas's paw. He didn't move, just flicked an ear, acknowledging its arrival. The drawing was of a police officer and a big dog standing between a little girl and a shadow. In shaky, bright blue crayon letters it read, "They keep me safe." Lila came skipping over, her cheeks flushed, hair tangled in soft chaos. She plopped down beside Atlas and leaned against him, breathing in his warm fur. He shifted slightly to accommodate her, as if this had always been their rhythm. "I told them, you know," she whispered, one hand absently petting his side. "In court, I told them everything." Atlas blinked slowly. "You helped me remember," she continued. "You helped me be brave." She looked toward the garden where the memorial stone stood, framed by roses, flanked by shadows growing longer with the setting sun. Then she spoke aloud, not just to Atlas now, but to the air, to the quiet, to wherever Daddy might be listening. Daddy was a hero, she said clearly. Atlas helped me remember. The words hung there for a beat, sacred in their stillness. From inside the house, Eleanor watched from the kitchen window, a mug of tea in her hand, heart too full for words. Sarah sat beside her, sketchbook open but untouched, the pencil paused mid-line. They exchanged a glance, one of those quiet, unspoken agreements between women who had survived too much and still chose to hope. Outside, a butterfly drifted past Lila's nose. She giggled and pointed. "See that, Atlas? Mommy says butterflies carry wishes." The big shepherd let out a gentle chuff and laid his head back down. His tail. She leaned closer, her voice a whisper again. "I wish more kids had dogs like you." A door creaked softly as Judge Grant and Agent DeLeon stepped out onto the porch. The judge had traded her cardigan for a pale scarf that fluttered behind her like a banner of quiet resilience. DeLeon carried a framed plaque, recently delivered, etched with gold and shaped like a badge. It read, "In memory of Officer David Carter, courage never silenced." They said nothing as they watched Lila. No need to. The moment didn't require commentary, only reverence. Lila stood again, spinning in the grass, arms wide like wings. The pups barked and jumped around her, trying to catch the hem of her dress. "We made it, Atlas," she shouted through laughter. "We really made it." And in that instant, with the wind lifting her voice, the sun resting on Atlas's back, and the truth finally having taken root in the very soil beneath them, the world felt healed. Not perfect, but honest. Eleanor eventually stepped outside and called softly, "Lila, it's almost time for dinner." "One more minute," the girl called back, then turned to Atlas again. "You'll stay here, won't you?" she asked. "Even when I grow up and go to big school and stuff?" Atlas didn't answer. He didn't have to. Lila smiled and gave him a kiss on the forehead. "Okay, that's what I thought." Then, with all the conviction of someone who had lived 100 years inside a tiny body, she looked back at the house and shouted, "Tell everyone the story. About Daddy and Atlas and the courtroom and the notebook and how the truth got out." Eleanor laughed gently. "I think they already know it, sweetheart." Lila grinned. "Good, 'cause it's my favorite story ever." And then, as the day faded into gold and the shadows curled gently around them all, she skipped back to the porch, puppies at her heels, heart wide open. Behind her, Atlas remained under the tree, eyes watching, memory intact, a sentinel not just for Lila, but for every child who had been silenced, every truth that had been buried, and every hero who never got the chance to finish their story. But now the story was told, and the voice that told it would never be forgotten. Not while laughter echoed through the yard, not while flowers bloomed around a name carved in stone, not while a German shepherd kept watch over a world he helped heal with silence, loyalty, and love. Sometimes the truest kind of love doesn't come with words. It comes on 4 paws, with a steady gaze and a heart that never wavers. Stories like this remind us that animals, especially loyal companions like German shepherds, have an uncanny way of holding us together when the world tries to break us. Their devotion, their quiet strength, it speaks straight to the soul. If you've ever looked into your dog's eyes and felt something unspoken, a knowing, a trust, you already understand the talking about. And if you've been wanting to strengthen that connection, maybe explore ways to better communicate or care for your dog's emotional needs, there's a gentle little resource I found recently. I'll leave the link below. No pressure, of course, just something that felt comforting and real, like a conversation between old friends. Because at the end of the day, our dogs aren't just pets. They're family, and sometimes they're the ones who help us remember who we are. Take care, and give your pup an extra ear scratch from me.